Hi, this is Josh Kulp. We are learning Daf Shevui, Masechet Kiddushin. We are on Daf Nun Bet, page 52. And there's a term that comes up in this Gemara, shadich, which we might translate today as arranged the marriage. It's shiduchin, shidduch, right? If you speak sort of Hebrew English kind of meld, and I want to explain a little bit what it is and how it appears in our sugya. So, as we should know by this point in the Masechet, in rabbinic times, Kiddushin and Nisuin, what I usually call betrothal and marriage, were separated into two stages. Kiddushin would have been done maybe a year before, maybe a long time before the marriage, and that was really, at least from what we mostly read, that was the time when, generally speaking, either the husband or the father of the husband would arrange the marriage with usually the father of the bride, and then the husband, or perhaps the father of the husband, would do a formal act which we call Kiddushin or betrothal, and that act has very, very high legal consequences. If the woman would need to get to be divorced, if she has sex with another man, that's considered adultery. There's certain obligations he has for her, certain rights that the two of them have over each other. For all intents and purposes, as hopefully we understand by now, Kiddushin is marriage without living together. And then Nisuin, marriage, is when the woman would go live in the husband's house. She would leave her father's house and go live in her husband's house. Now, at some point in Jewish history, and it's really unclear, Kiddushin and Nisuin became folded up into one ceremony done at the same time. Obviously, that's what we do today. If you've been to a Jewish wedding, if you're familiar with a Jewish wedding, you know that Kiddushin is done immediately before Nisuin. There's two sets of brachot. Usually they read the ketubah in between the two. And that avoids a lot of the problems that a formal act of Kiddushin creates. Having Kiddushin a year or some long time before the Nisuin is not a great advantage. What happens if the husband disappears? What happens if the couple changes their mind? It's because there's so many legal consequences with Kiddushin, a formal act of Kiddushin, it's messy. So certainly by post-Talmudic times, Jews had begun to combine Kiddushin with Nisuin, and this way there's none of that really legally murky gray area, and basically marriage happens all at one point. And if they decide to break off the marriage earlier, there's no consequences to that. There's no economic consequences. There's less economic consequences, I should say, not none. She doesn't need a divorce. If she were to sleep with another man, it's not considered adultery, etc., etc. It's a lot neater to combine Kiddushin and Nisuin. But clearly, marriage isn't something that just happens in one day, right? That's not the way it works in our society either. For the most part, people in Western society, at least as I'm familiar with it, I'm not that familiar with non-Western society, they don't have just one period of marriage. You have an arrangement, and that arrangement, it carries a certain amount of consequences, maybe not particularly strong consequences, and that arrangement we call engagement, and then they get married a certain time later. In America, it tends to be later than it is in Israel. That custom varies, but it's not usually a day, or certainly not an hour. It's usually a period of between several months and maybe even up to a couple years. The Talmud already seems to have po v'sham, here and there we hear of a third stage. We hear of shidduchin, right? This contract between the husband and the wife, or the father of the husband and the father of the wife, or some combination between all of these parties that comes before betrothal, and perhaps betrothal is still separated from nisuin. It's very hard to know the relationship in some of these texts. It might be that some of these texts imply that Kiddushin and Nisuin were already combined. So that's what we hear only in the later levels of the Gemara in our sugya, that there's a difference if he betroths her with her stolen property. There's a difference if he did Shidduchin first, or if he didn't do Shidduchin first. If he did Shidduchin first, then we know that she really wanted to be betrothed to him. So even if she's accepting back her stolen property, we know in any case that she wanted to be betrothed to him, otherwise they wouldn't have had shidduchin. So there's no problem in ascertaining the will of the woman. We can't say, oh, she was only taking that money back because that was a way of recovering it. If there was no shidduchin when she accepts her own stolen item back, she may have said, well, I'll be betrothed to you only because that was the only way that she could recover her money. So that's the institution of shidduchin. We don't really know about it all that much. Today we use the term to mean matchmaking. But it doesn't mean matchmaking. In the Talmud, it's probably more formal than simply matchmaking, although in some parts of the world, let's say in Haredi society, certainly, when the shidduch really happens, it has a certain formal consequences, and breaking off a shidduch could have like not terrible consequences, but it could have some social consequences as well. That's where the word shadchan, right? You might be familiar with it from shtisel, or you might be familiar with it from Fiddler on the Roof. The role of the shadchanit, usually a woman, but sometimes a man, in Haredi society is still a very important role.